Welcome to Your Path to Nonprofit Leadership, the weekly podcast that features the very best in career development in the nonprofit sector. I'm your host, Patton McDowell, and committed to bringing you ideas and resources that will help you build your professional development plan. Now, whether you are tuning in for the first time or are a regular listener, I'm glad to have you. If you want to be a nonprofit leader or maybe more effective in the role you're in now, you're in the right place. I'm glad to bring you these weekly conversations with nonprofit experts who are on the cutting edge of our sector. And if you would do me a favor, find the share button. Usually it's in the top of the episode graphic on the device you're holding right now. Mine has 3 dots, and that allows you to share this episode with one other person. You can email it to them, you can text it to them. Either way, you're helping us build a global community focused on nonprofit leadership. And I bet this is an episode you will want to share with a friend or colleague in the nonprofit space because it's a great conversation with Autumn Keck, and she's the perfect person to talk about your foundation and grants management program. Now, I get it. You see the enormous potential of grant funding in your community for your nonprofit organization, and you want to make sure you're getting your fair share. And I bet you've got board members who are also reminding you of big grants they have seen out in the community and wonder why you're not more effective. Well, of course, as you already know, and Autumn articulates beautifully, it's not as easy as perhaps an outsider thinks in terms of obtaining these grant-funded sources. And she does, however, have great advice about how you can be more effective in the grants management game. And we talk about some of the key challenges and misconceptions that maybe you can better articulate to those in your community, your board, and even some of your staff colleagues. Autumn lays out the different stages of a typical grant application and how you can be more effective at each stop along the way. And she also offers 3 different checklists. I mean, literally, I was taking notes because these are checklists that can help you build your nonprofit organization's grant toolkit so that you can be more effective and more efficient in pursuing this all too important funding source. Well, lots of reasons to check out the show notes for this episode. It's number 143. Just go to the podcast or the news page at pattonmcdowell.com and you'll find all of the resources that we discussed, as well as more information on Autumn and the great work she's doing through Scribe with nonprofit organizations everywhere. Of course, speaking of resources, while you're on our website, make sure you connect with us. We're on all the social media platforms. And of course, if you go to the bottom of the homepage and click on the free resources sign up, you'll get weekly information pieces with resources just like this episode with Autumn. And we'd be happy to have more conversations. Also on the homepage, you can schedule a time to talk to us. We can learn more about your organization and maybe more about your journey toward nonprofit leadership, especially if one of our coaching, training, or maybe unique mastermind programs would be a good fit for you. Without further ado, please enjoy my conversation with Autumn Keck. Autumn, thank you for joining me on the path.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm excited about this conversation. Autumn, you are the perfect person to talk about a topic that's on virtually every nonprofit leader's mind. Obviously, fundraising in general is a headline for nonprofit leaders, but in particular, I think the aspect of foundation and grant writing is of concern. They want to make sure they're doing the right thing. They know there are funds out there that they want to try to obtain, but I sense often they're stressed about it. You know, they're not doing the right thing, not doing enough of the right thing. And I wonder, as you have many of these conversations, what are the headlines coming out of these conversations, or what is the biggest challenge that you see nonprofit leaders face as it relates to their grants program?
So the biggest challenge I see for nonprofit leaders is relying on grant funding as their largest source of income in their organization. Grant funding is just one piece of the pie. Your fundraising program should include individual giving, a well thought out stewardship cycle for donors, a major gifts program, and even special events. This bolsters your grant program in the eyes of funders who don't want to be your only source of income. And it also shows a plan for long-term sustainability for your organization and your program.
So well put, Autumn. And I'm sure every listener in wherever they are, their community, there's that super wealthy family foundation or whatever, independent private foundation. And I guess your point is you don't want them to over rely on a single source. And I guess, are you seeing some organizations that are in fact vulnerable to that kind of single source funder?
Yes. I have actually been talking to a lot of my clients who are my new clients coming in. And as we're going over their grants, their past grants with them, they mentioned that, oh, this foundation has now let us know that in the next 2 years, they're really pulling back their funding for us because they've been funders for the past 10 years. And they're trying to find ways to supplement that income with other grants. And what I always tell them is look at your entire fundraising program. Do you have like a sustainable individual giving program? Because that is going to be your best source of long-term income for any type of nonprofit organization.
Yeah, there's what I would call, Autumn, kind of funder envy. You know,
Yes.
your board member reads the article about the huge $1 million grant that Michael Jordan's foundation or the Levine Foundation here in Charlotte gave. And so do they come to you, Autumn, with like, hey, so-and-so across town got this big grant. How come we can't get it? And, I wonder if that just kind of perpetuates exactly what you're talking about.
Yes. So I get that question all the time, actually. And we go through and talk about like what are our strengths as an organization and how we want to present ourselves, as opposed to focusing on what the other organization has gotten. A lot of a lot of things go into play in terms of getting the grant. And it's not just writing the grant. It could be the relationship that an organization has with a funder. It could be their strong board and how they're advocating for the organization in the community. And it could be the well-written grant and program goals and evaluation that an organization is showing. So I try to talk about the full picture. And if we're lacking in any aspect of that picture, then how we can bolster that to improve our chances for grant funding.
Well, this is perfect. And I know you're going to break this down for us in ways that'll be very practical for our listeners. But it reinforces your overall point. If we're over reliant on grant funding, we're in trouble. And I'm guessing you would confirm, Autumn, that a lot of funders are going to ask that question. We're not here to rescue you. We're not going to give you 90% of your funding. Is it true that that's in essence an eligibility question now that many grant funders are asking, that they want to see the diversity of your funding streams?
Yes, every grant funder, usually their last question is, tell me about the sustainability of your program after this grant funding runs out. So they want to see a well-developed and well-thought-out plans that not only includes grant funding, but includes your individual giving program. They want to know that your board has a development committee that is actively working to obtain other sources of funding for you. They want to see the entire picture so they can feel comfortable that, in 5 years, if they want to change their focus, that they're not leaving a valuable program hanging because the program hasn't attracted any other funding.
Such a good point. And such a good reminder. And I would think a confidence boost to the listener right now who has board members kind of breathing down their neck about their funding program solving all the problems. And in turn, they need to respond, hey, board member, we need to diversify. We need to build that individual giving program and all the things, Autumn, that you are suggesting. Well, we're going to break it down even more. But as a self-professed grants writing nerd, and I don't use that term unless you use it, but you are just the perfect one. You dived into these things. Tell me about your background. What led you to the work you're doing now?
Sure. I actually kind of stumbled into fundraising right out of college. I was interviewing for jobs in public relations, and I was a final two candidate for a job. And the lady said, you know what? I don't think that you're the exact right for this job, but I have a friend who's looking for a fundraising director within her organization, and she wants to take on somebody new to the field so she can help kind of mold them for the organization. So I started off right away at a health and human service nonprofit in Delaware. In the first year of my career, I was lucky enough to take a week-long course on grant writing with the Grantsmanship Center and learned about all the ins and outs of grant writing. As I progressed throughout my career, I continued to grant write for some organizations. Some organizations that would be my whole job, and then other organizations, it would just be a small piece. But as I grew older and started expanding my family, I started to really value flexibility and autonomy in my professional life.
Yeah.
Consulting became the next step, which eventually led to the formation of my business, Scribe LLC. So Scribe is a fundraising consulting firm that connects nonprofits to the philanthropic community by effectively sharing the organization's impact on the people they serve. 99% of our work is centered around grant writing and grants management services. So we've been able to raise millions of dollars through grant writing to help organizations really increase their impact.
It's awesome what you do. I've seen evidence of it here in the Charlotte region, and I know you're not limited to the Charlotte region for sure, but I'm excited to share kind of what you do. And we'll talk about that because, as you were quick to acknowledge, there are other resources like you and other communities around the world. And hopefully our listeners today are going to better understand how to work with a talented firm like yours to improve their fundraising, in particular grants. You know, it occurs to me, Autumn, that those early, would you say that early training in grantsmanship paid off? In other words, if there's a listener now thinking about getting into the field of fundraising and nonprofit leadership, do you look back on some of those early courses, I guess, and say, yeah, that was huge in terms of setting you in the right direction?
Yes, the grantsmanship training, I actually still refer back to that training to this day, over 20 years since I started that training. It was valuable in a way that I didn't even realize at the time, because it really broke down every piece of the grant puzzle and really had you start to look about how you wanted to communicate to the funder. So we spent a day on each part of what a grant application should look like, how you should really frame your organization to get funding. And then from that week-long course, I've really built on it with continuing my professional development. But that was really such a great foundation to start with, because I left there and I felt empowered to write grants. And within a year, I wrote a grant, a federal grant at that, to supply computers to every household in Opportunity Zone in Wilmington, Delaware. So
Wow.
That was huge. Yeah, that was huge. So the Grantsmanship Center really prepared me to do that.
Well, I love that. And as you know, I'm a big fan of professional development planning in the nonprofit sector. And so might include in the show notes that and other resources I know you're going to share, because I know we've got listeners thinking, all right, what do I need to do to enhance my candidacy maybe for my next job, or even enhance my role, in my current fundraising or leadership opportunity. So thanks for sharing that. Let's dive into stuff. Autumn, you got a lot of good things to share with us. And one, you've talked about this concept of kind of, disproportionate level of expectations or unrealistic expectations around grant funding in terms of my total revenue as a nonprofit organization. You also talk about another, I guess, maybe this is a myth or a challenge, the concept of a rapid return on grants. What do you mean by that? Or what is the kind of the challenge you see in this kind of rapid return mindset?
When I'm first talking to a new client or even some nonprofit leaders around the community, I would start with educating them on the grant process and setting realistic expectations for their organization. Writing a grant is just one facet of the entire grant process. First, I would start with getting an organization grant ready. Next, the research process starts by researching funders with a focus that align with their organization and programs. Then we would talk about contacting program officers or community relations team to learn more about their foundation and how they work. And then also that puts your organization on the radar. And that's another key step in the grant writing process. Finally, applying in the right cycle. If there are multiple cycles within a foundation, grant cycles within a foundation, you may have a higher chance of receiving funding in a certain cycle. So you kind of really need to talk to the program officers to see what cycle that you would fit best in.
I know it varies, Autumn. And sorry to interrupt you, I guess, but when you got people coming to you basically saying, all right, I'm ready. I just started
Mhm.
out, get me
Yes.
grant money right away. Right. That's in essence what they're asking. Is there a time? I guess I know it varies, but is there a timeline that you almost have to immediately caution, like, hey, it's going to be 6 months, or it's going to be a full 12-month yearly cycle? Or how do you respond, I guess, to that urgency question that I'm sure you get?
Well, that's exactly it. And I just let them know that grant cycles start from when you submit the grant to when you actually receive an approval. That can be, some foundations have a quick turnaround. That could be anywhere from 60 to 90 days. But you also have to keep in mind that there are some foundations and corporations that run from 6 to 9 months. So you could really be looking at your fiscal year in June and applying for a grant in June that really you may not be able to utilize that funding into the next fiscal year. So you need to take everything into account. And then if you're a newer organization and you're still working on honing your message and getting down all the necessary steps that you need to become grant ready, it could take much longer to get your first approved grants. So for me, educating organizations on this process is one of the first steps to building great working relationship, but also setting realistic expectations.
Yeah, it's such a good point. And again, we understand the urgency of funding, but your cautionary tale there of let's make sure we do it right. Right. I guess
Yes.
ultimately that's what you're trying to get them to do, set up for the long-term sustainable process. Do you recommend certain investments? Autumn, obviously we'll talk about the services you could bring to an organization or someone like you, but if I'm a nonprofit leader, do you want me to invest in research tools or I guess certain infrastructure items to make sure I'm ready in that early stage?
First, even backing up a little bit further, you need to ask yourself some questions as an organization before you even write your first grant. So as you just talked about infrastructure, you want to make sure that infrastructure is in place to support the program if it's funded. Asking yourself questions like, do we have a staffing plan? Do we have a place to run the program? How will we recruit our participants are some of the key things that you need to think about. Then you need to think about questioning yourself around, do you have a working board that can make connections and advocate for your organization? If you don't, how do you go about getting that working board? How do you go about getting volunteers who are excited about your organization's mission? How do you recruit them? You also need to look at your finances. Are your finances in order? Did you file taxes the previous year or complete an audit? Do you have a compelling message as to why this program is needed? Is that message backed up with data and statistics? Do you have an elevator speech down for yourself, your staff, and your board members to really go out into the community and drum up support for the program? Can you clearly communicate your program goals, what your activities will be, what your outcomes will be? And then how will you collect the data and measure those program outcomes? And then do you have a realistic budget that is not all dependent on grants? If you can answer no to one of these questions, I would suggest spending more time on it before applying for grants.
Yeah, such a good checklist you literally just gave us. And instead of just rushing to a grant funder and hoping that the kind of urgency of your need or even the compelling message you believe you have, what you just reeled off, Autumn, are literally what the grant funder is going to be. That's their checklist, right?
Yes.
They're going to be going down that list. And I also thought you made a great point that while there is the official kind of checklist of information and so forth, I guess grant funding is still a relationship game. So is that your point, that your board members may have connections to grant funders and their boards of directors, or is that how do you put that into play?
Yes. I would look at your board or ask your board who their connections are right off the bat. And that's who we should look at applying to first, because your board members, those personal relationships and those professional relationships can have a greater effect even sometimes than the actual written grant application. They put the grant application on the radar for your organization amongst funders that you may struggle to get in the door with if those relationships didn't exist. I can't stress enough that how a working board, a really active board can affect your grant writing program.
Do you want my board members to have to reach out to grant funders? Obviously, a lot of the larger foundations have staff. And often, I guess, they are open to preliminary conversations, but do you suggest kind of caution there, or is it okay to just have an early stage conversation with the staff of a foundation, even if I'm not fully ready?
No, I think it's great to have a early conversation with program staff at a foundation. Oftentimes, even when I was in a staff role, I would just pick up the phone and call a program officer. I know things have probably tightened up a lot since then in the past 10 or 11 years, but even sending an email, requesting some of their time might be a good first step. Having your board member make that connection to somebody within the organization, make that introduction for you, connecting with the person on LinkedIn. It's a lot of ways that you can kind of put your organization on the radar. So when your grant application comes up, they're like, oh, I remember them, or, I remember receiving an email from them. The only time I would not do it is when an organization says basically, don't contact us, we'll contact you.
Right.
You really want to respect the rules of the organization that you are seeking funding from.
That's such a good point. And you don't want to be obnoxious and overload them
Exactly.
with outreach. And the other thing I've heard from some funders, you and I both have talked to, that, a funder will say, look, I'm happy to talk to them, but they should at least do their homework, and because our website very clearly articulates the types of funding we do. And so it seems to me that would irritate a program staff person if someone comes to them seeking funding and they're like, hey, if you just read our website, you would see we don't fund capital projects, right? Or we don't fund, fill in the blank. But do you see that kind of disconnect occurring as well?
No, I advise all my clients to do your research in the beginning before you talk to. You want to come from a place of knowledge, especially when talking to these program funders, because again, every impression that you make is a step closer to you getting approved or declined for your grant funding. So I would suggest doing the research beforehand. As a matter of fact, that's what I offer. I help them do the research and develop a strategy for talking to the funder. So for instance, even if it's a long-term funder, let's say that you already have a relationship with the funder and they've been giving you, $3,000 each year, and they have the capacity to give much more based upon your research of them. Maybe strike up a conversation about some new programs and some things that you're working on. Really try to get in depth with your program so they can know exactly what you're doing and how it aligns with their focus.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. And yeah, there's a common sense element to it, but there is a preparation that you're such a good champion for. And well, I guess it leads to, in terms of these processes and staffing them, I get this call a lot, Autumn, all right, I just need to hire myself a full-time grant writer. That will solve all my issues. But I wonder if you could speak to that, because I think it's difficult to find someone that is talented that my organization can afford. But that is where I think you often come in, right, Autumn? That like, hey, yes, they could try to find someone and hire them full time, but they might also use someone like you.
Yes, I get these calls all the time as well. And I think the key things that you need to kind of look at is where you are as an organization. Are you having trouble locating somebody? What are the skills that you think that a person needs to work for your organization? So a lot of times new grant writers will come in and they might have 2 to 3 years, maybe fundraising experience, or maybe a creative writing background, which is not necessarily a writing background, but it gives them a basis of how to hone in on that compelling story for your organization. So first, I think they need to think about what type of time and resources that they want to put in for a grant writer. If it's on staff or even as a consultant, what type of time do they have? What are other aspects of their job? Are they solely a grant writer? Because it's very few organizations, especially smaller ones, maybe under $10 million budgets, who can afford a sole grant writer. You have many people in development departments who are wearing multiple hats, and grant writing takes a lot of time. Like I said, it's just not the grant writing, it's all the relationship building and research that goes into it. So is it a full-time grant writer? Is it a part-time grant writer? And you kind of have to decide if that makes sense. And if it's a part-time grant writer, maybe you can look at adding a consultant to your team. Like thinking about what a consultant could bring to your team overall. And the consultant can do a lot of things for you, including grant readiness, research, helping you craft that strategy for funders, writing the actual grant. But the most important thing that I'm hearing from clients is managing that calendar of all the due dates and developing timelines to submit the application. That takes up so much time for a development team to stay on top of that, especially a small shop to stay on top of that, but also grow those other important aspects of their whole fundraising plan.
Well, clearly, I mean, you and I are biased. This conversation obviously is lifting up someone like yourself who brings an expertise that I would suggest most nonprofits can't afford.
Yes.
You know, and so the argument for considering outsourcing grants management is that you get a level of talent and frankly at a lower price point than if you were to try to find someone, hire them full time, right? And so that's where they're at least I think organizations should think about it. And Autumn, you made this point to me that most of your work, I believe, not just because of COVID, but can be done remotely. So an organization doesn't have to have somebody locally, right, to join their team.
Exactly. COVID has changed so many ways, of course, for every industry on how we relate to each other, how we're able to get work done. So it has basically, the entire workplace environment has shifted for me as a consultant as well. It has brought a greater awareness to the benefits of outsourcing a nonprofit's grant writing services. So for instance, nonprofits are now a little less fearful of outsourcing their work because everyone is remote. So, they have experience in building those relationships with staff remotely, and it's opened up the world to outsource people and help them prepare to build trust in those consulting relationships. Google Workplace, Zoom, Dropbox, and any good project management systems help clients feel connected to their work and informed at all times. It could be a less stressful thing for your staff to outsource that grant writing piece of it while they're concentrating on the other pieces of the fundraising program. Plus, I think hiring, as we all know, has been harder for all industries. So nonprofits hiring a consultant has become more of an option than it ever was before.
Yeah, makes perfect sense. And again, I'm just glad you and I are going to at least get our listeners to think about, all right, does it make sense to at least explore some of these, outsourced options? And I would suggest that often it may prove to be the right answer. And obviously a conversation with someone like you can help reinforce that. But all right, so for the sake of someone who brings you in, Autumn, how do you set up kind of your work? You're going to look at my existing kind of grant funding, and I guess part of it might be you're going to help me manage the ongoing reporting and maybe research of new potential funders. But obviously you can't guarantee dollar amounts because you don't know what is going to happen. But maybe just talk at a high level about what it looks like when you're kind of working with a client partner.
Sure. Well, I think first of all, if we're looking at a small organization, I'll give you a small organization or an organization who is taking their leap into the grant writing program. So first, I would like to look at an assessment of their commonly used grant documents that are requested from funders, making sure that they had their 501c3 ready, their board of directors list, organizational charts, and all their financial documents, including the 990 and the audit, readily accessible. Next, I would work on a logic model for each program, talking through what their overall goal is, what their inputs to the program, the activities, outputs, and outcomes. And I'll talk a little bit deeper about that. The inputs would be everything and everybody that are needed to make up the program and help it run. The activities are what you're actually doing. What are the actual pieces of what you're actually doing in the program? The outputs would be how many people you're going to serve. And then the outcomes would be what's the actual impact on the people you serve. So for instance, a workforce development program, you would look at like what percentage of program participants are moving from unemployed to family sustaining income within a certain amount of time. That would be that's a powerful statistic for a workforce development program.
Right.
And that would be something that an organization who didn't have a dedicated staff person or a consultant would really need to consider about how they're going to look at how they develop those outcomes. Next, I would talk to you about reviewing your budgets and making sure they paint a realistic picture of what's really needed for what type of money is really needed to pull off the program.
Right.
And then develop a plan to track and measure your intended outcomes. And some considerations may include, are you going to do pre and post surveys? Do you need a control group? Do you need to work with an independent evaluator? But overall, just thinking through how you can clearly communicate how you plan to manage the evaluation process.
Love this concept. Well, one, I love that you talk in almost checklist format. So there's a real practical value to, again, I'm excited. I want to start raising money through grants, but you're like, no, let's first do an audit. And it seems to me, Autumn, you're helping me build a toolkit, right? Because
exactly.
there are a half dozen standard items that almost every grant funder is going to ask for. And my guess is when you arrive at an organization, they don't have them or they're just scattered. Is that kind of fair?
They don't have them. And I think the biggest kind of red flag to me to kind of pull back and not start is that they don't have a budget and they can't clearly communicate their outcomes. Yeah. So they can say, for example, for like a food pantry, they can say, well, we're going to provide food to 400 people a year, but what's the intended outcome of that? Is it to, offset costs so they can save for housing? Is it to offset costs so they'll be able to put their child in daycare? Are you providing these meals at the time that's convenient to the families? Are these meals that the families can pick up? Are they staying there and eating them? So just really thinking through what the program is and putting it into, I say grant speak, so that we're really communicating the impact to the funder.
Makes perfect sense. And that's such a good example. You're right. I think of organizations, well-intentioned, that may struggle because of some of those informational gaps or the kind of the toolkit gaps that you first need to help them with so they can be more effective in these funder conversations and ultimately grant applications. So that's one element. Autumn, you come in and you help my organization manage this process. Yes. Another scenario that you and I talked about was, all right, what if I have, let's say, a junior member of my team that I think has great potential to be an effective grant writer? You can also help with training. Is that right, Autumn? And what does that look like if I'm an organization that maybe has somebody on staff that just, has potential but needs training?
At Scribe, we also offer grant coaching services. So that's bringing in a coach that will look at your overall grant program and see where changes need to be made. A few things that help right away, whether you bring in a grant coach like myself or you invest in some more professional development, is make sure that you're tailoring the message to the specific funder. So it's helpful. A lot of nonprofits ask me, well, can you just give me 2 or 3 templates and I'll just use those to apply for all the grants? Right. Well, that's a sure way not to get funded, because you're really
wrong answer. Yeah,
exactly. There. You're not tailoring your message to the specific funder and really showing how that funding will align with your program, and how it really helps them advance their mission and increase your community impact. So you really need to newer grant writers need to really focus on honing in on that compelling message. Also, it's always helpful to have somebody review your grants before sending them out. And it doesn't even have to be another member of your development team. It could be somebody on the program staff. It could actually be somebody out of the organization, because they can ask questions from a point of almost like ignorance, like they know nothing about the program.
Right.
So things will come up for them logically that you may not be thinking, because you know the program back and front. A set of eyes is always good. I will also tell them to join AFP, Association of Fundraising Professionals, and the Grant Professionals Association, because they gain a wealth of knowledge just from talking to their peers, continuing their professional development, and learning through their experiences as grant writers. And then getting back to the coaching, a coach sometimes can make small tweaks to how you even present your application that can totally change the outcome for your application. They need to look at a coach. I typically kind of look at what your Is it backed up by that data and that statistics that are really going to kind of punch the funder in the throat and make them be like, oh, I didn't even realize that this was such a problem here in Charlotte or, whatever community that you were in. So really crafting that message can change the entire outcome of your grant program. And sometimes a coach is needed and then continued professional development as well.
Well, it's a fantastic illustration of how a coach can help, the fresh set of eyes, or as you said, other fresh sets of eyes within the organization, maybe outside of the development office, right? Who can just ask the kind of, sometimes the you can't see the forest through the trees, right? When you're buried in the grant writing process. So great point there. And I guess it varies, I'm sure, Autumn, but when you're coaching or training, do you kind of have certain time frames that you work in? How long does it take to do some of the training you do on average when you're working with someone who wants to get better in the field?
Sure. I would say no less than 3 months. And that just depends on where they are in their grant writing career. So if they've already written a grant or written a few grants and have a year or so under their belt, it probably would take 3 months to kind of look through, review their grants and start making some tweaks to their current grants that they're working on. And also thinking about well-developed strategies for each individual funder. I just had an opportunity to work with an organization here locally over the summer, and it was so rewarding because they had a grant writer who had transitioned from another role during COVID, and she was really at the beginning of her grant writing career. She knew how to write grants. They had great information, they had great outcomes, but it was just the way she was structuring the grants. And once we changed the structure of the grants, they started to see a return on their investment from the grant coaching, and it ended up ultimately helping fund their program even more.
It's another great illustration of what you can do. I would also say more broadly too, for a nonprofit leader listening, strategic investment in professional development.
Yes.
Think about how every one of our listeners probably has some talented folks on their staff. And if we were to invest in someone like you, Autumn, coming in and making that person twice as effective, that's the greatest investment we could make this year. And it sounds like your example there was a good one. Like, hey, for a relatively small investment, you really helped multiply the revenue that organization generated.
Exactly. So investing in your grant program with time and resources will increase your return on investment significantly. So whether it's investing in professional development for yourself as an executive director or a development leader, or your grant writers taking the time to build relationships with funders, or hiring a consultant or a coach to help coach your staff and start and grow your grant writing program, it will pay off significantly. Keep setting realistic expectations for yourself and your staff, and develop a year-round strategy. So just don't apply for that one $500,000 grant to pay for your whole program. Develop your whole fundraising program and keep the grant piece as a piece of the pie.
That's fantastic advice overall. In fact, I was going to ask you, as you summarize these concepts, maybe walk us through one more time, though, if I'm a nonprofit leader, what are the different elements of every grant proposal? I think, and I've seen some of your great kind of social media posts where you've walked the reader through this, but maybe you could summarize again, what are those different elements of every grant proposal that we need to understand?
Sure. So all the grant writers will be able to relate to this sentence. In a perfect world where you can send in a proposal with no character counts, no word limits, you would break an application down into these sections. You would start off with your executive summary. Your executive summary gives them a good look into your organization, what your mission and vision is, what you're about. You always put the ask at the top. That's been my philosophy. So while a funder is reading your application, they can know exactly what you're asking for. And then the rest of what you're writing is backing up why it's such an important need. So the next part of the application would be your statement of needs, and it would talk about why the program is needed so much in your community. You would tell your compelling story there and back it up with data and statistics for the program. So for instance, if you were talking about why you wanted to open a community cafe or a food pantry program, you may want to look at statistics around like what is the food insecurity in the county, how many grocery stores are in the county, what's the hunger rate in the county, what's the poverty rate in the county, and add those statistics in to that statement of need to really punch the funder in the gut and really make them want to sit up and say, wow, I didn't know that this was such a need here.
Right, right.
And next you will go into your program description where you would discuss all the activities around your program. So you would discuss how you would recruit your participants, what actual activities that you will be doing, what part of town will you be doing them in, what type of staff would it take to run these activities, and really get in depth with that as much as you can, because again, a well thought out and communicated plan gives more confidence to the funder.
I'm celebrating your checklist already. Keep going. Please keep going.
Sure. Next, we would talk about your measurement outcomes and evaluation. So you want to make sure that you're showing the funder that you're setting goals for your program. You would say maybe 70% of people who started the specific maybe job training program graduated within 6 months. You may want to talk about how you're moving somebody again from unemployment to family sustaining employment. You really want to talk about what type of evaluation tools that you're going to use. Again, is it like a third-party evaluator or what you already have in place, what clearly communicated evaluation plan that you already have in place that you'll be able to effectively evaluate your program. Next, we want to talk about your budget. What are some things in your budget that paint a realistic story for your funder? So are we making sure that we're including salaries, all the administrative costs, but really honing in on what the program costs are going to be and making sure that they're realistic and they sound appropriate for your funder. And then in closing, I would just reiterate what the strongest points of the application were and show alignment with the funder and just thank them for their time.
Fantastic. That's the third checklist I've made note of, Autumn, thanks to you. And I would encourage listeners to literally rewind this part of our episode together, because what you just reeled off, frankly, is something I should be thinking in my head. All right, can we articulate that? Can we demonstrate that? Among your many good points, again, I think is that distinction between outputs and outcomes.
Yes.
And I like your illustration. Our output might be that we are providing job training for 400 people, but an outcome, I guess, would be that half of them are going to get a job, right?
Yes.
Would that be maybe an example of that? That's what a funder's looking for. Good that you're doing a lot of training, but we want to know what the outcome is in terms of helping people gain employment.
Even more significant outcome for a funder would be like, what percentage of people got a job at a family sustaining income rate or at a rate that would help carry them out of poverty.
Great
so
point.
if your participants are going through this training and they're getting jobs that are still minimum wage that makes them have to have 2 or 3 jobs, then the training
that's not a good outcome, right?
Exactly.
Right.
It's not a good outcome.
Yeah.
But if you're looking at, okay, we have our participants average a starting salary of $18.50 per hour. And then our participants are still maintaining their job after 6 months. Those are stronger outcomes to really show your funder.
Yeah, fantastic. And like everything else you've shared, Autumn, great advice for organizations trying to improve this essential part. And as you said from the very beginning, part of their fundraising program, not the only one, but an integral part. And you have provided the expertise I knew you would. Autumn, you probably get this question from people approaching you about, hey, I'm thinking about getting into the nonprofit space, or maybe even as a grant writer in particular. Any final advice you might offer someone thinking about a career path like yours?
Sure. I would say for myself, just starting off, knowing nothing about fundraising, but really excited to learn a lot. My biggest the things that helped me the most were my memberships in Association for Fundraising Professionals and the Grant Professionals Association, because that gave me a scope of what a fundraising career could be and how I could take it in many different directions. And in particular, the Grant Professional Association really does a good job of helping grant writers grow and offer a lot of professional development opportunities. So if they are looking for grant writing overall, I would say do that. Perhaps take some classes. Since I took the Grantsmanship Center course, now over 20 years ago, there are a lot of other courses that are available that may be more affordable to somebody young in their fundraising career and a nonprofit that they're working for, that they could search out and look for and take those courses to help develop those development skills. Take time to understand how grant writing fits into the entire fundraising program. I think it's great to learn about grant writing, but I think you need to learn how it affects not only the entire fundraising program, but the programs that you're running as well. And then overall, I would say just continue to write, continue to hone your skills, and perhaps even look for a mentor or a grant coach to help you along the way.
Great advice, much of which we're going to include in the show notes, because you've given me a number of items that I want our listeners to be able to, find as a resource, including connecting with you, of course, yourself, Autumn,
Yes.
and the great work you're doing at Scribe. If I can ask for one more parting gift amongst the many gifts you've already offered, how about a book? As you know, I ask every guest to share maybe a recommendation of a book that's been meaningful to them, or one that you might recommend to our listeners.
Sure. And going back, I know I've mentioned it a few times, but the Grantsmanship Center, a book that they gave us along with that week-long course was Program Planning and Proposal Writing by Norton Kerwitz. And you can go back, I still go back and refer to that sometimes when I'm having a particular hard time coming up with a case for support. So that'll take you from the beginning to in terms of how to write a grant, how to help shape those programs so that they're grant ready, and is really a resource throughout your whole entire career.
That's fantastic. And again, like this episode and your advice, very specific in the grant space, I knew you'd have a good book that someone could add literally to their bookshelf and enhance their current role, or perhaps make them more suitable for a role down the road. Autumn, again, thank you. Where can people find out more about you and the great work you're doing through Scribe?
Sure. You can check me out on my website, which is www.scribellcnc.com, or you can connect with me on LinkedIn at Autumn Keck or at Scribe's business page.
We'll put it all in the show notes. More reason to check it out. Lots of great resources here. Autumn, thank you again for joining me on The Path.
Thank you, Pat, and I really appreciate it, and I've enjoyed talking to you.
Well, I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Autumn as much as I did, and came away with some practical ideas that can guide you on your professional journey, and equally important, help you and your nonprofit organization be more effective in its effort to obtain grant funding. Don't forget about the show notes for this episode. It's number 143. Just go to our website, pattonmcdowell.com, and you can find out more about Autumn, the various grant resources she lifted up, as well as more information on the great work she's doing in terms of training and grants management for nonprofit organizations through her Scribe organization. As always, please share this episode with someone else on the path. And if you haven't already, go to the podcast page, the new and improved podcast page at pattonmcdowell.com, and you'll see the follow button linking to all of the primary podcast platforms. Don't miss out on any of these weekly episodes. They come out every Thursday. And of course, if you like this episode, we've got a whole lot more for you to check out. Just go to the episodes button at the top of the page there, and you can scroll through thumbnails of each and every of our great conversations. Thanks as always for what you are doing in the nonprofit sector, especially right now, and keep up the good work for causes that are most meaningful to you. I'll keep bringing you content that can help you do it even better. Have a great week, and I'll see you next time on The Path.